Justin is all yours.
Thank you, Carol. I appreciate it. Good afternoon, everyone. We're going to talk today about the issues associated with measuring business loss impact associated with Gulf oil spill, and I do think that this presents some unusual questions and some uncertainties that I haven't dealt with before, and I think it'll be interesting to see how this all pans out. So some of this is my perspective, but I grew up in the Louisiana area, and I was down there last week at a conference in New Orleans. But it appears that there's a gap between the news coverage of what's going on and the underlying economic events that are going on. For instance, you don't seem to read a lot about the commercial fishermen and their plight, and the oystermen and the oil field workers that had jobs that were pretty good and pretty good paying jobs, and may not be able to replace those, at least along the Gulf Coast for a while. And that depends a lot on where the moratorium on deep water drilling goes. In terms of businesses impacted, I've sort of listed how different kinds of businesses are affected, either directly from the result of the spill and the moratorium, or indirectly. On the left side of the chart, you can see that some of the larger businesses from these coastal areas of Louisiana, commercial fishing has been pretty much shut down because of an inability to harvest fish from an area that has oil in it. And the chemistry of the spill is, I think, a little bit unusual too. There's been a lot of oil spills in the past. Usually the oil flows to the surface, the lighter portions of the oil evaporate off, and the tar that's left either drops to the bottom or washes ashore. This time, there's a lot of dispersants that have been injected into the flow from the well, and a consequence of those dispersants is like mixing detergent in oil. The oil isn't all going to the top. It's a lot of it staying below the surface, and it's traveling below the surface as well. One of the things brought up last week, someone from the Jefferson Parish or county government said that because of the dispersants, oil wasn't all being collected by the booms, these floating barriers. A lot of it was going under the booms, and that was something that they hadn't seen before, and they believe it's a consequence of the dispersants. So anyway, the short story is that this has affected the quality of the fish and the saleability of the fish and the willingness of people to buy it. So it's really impacted commercial fishing greatly. Sport fishing is a much smaller business, but it's still important down there. That's got the same thing. And beach recreation, we think of as not such a big business, but there are a lot of hotels and casinos that are in that area, and their occupancy is down. And at least for smaller companies, this could even threaten the viability of those operations or those companies. Last, oil and gas exploration itself is not just people who are working on those rigs, but there's a fairly large infrastructure and companies that support the oil and gas exploration. Probably the largest one in that area is Hornbeck Offshore, which is based in Covington, Louisiana. And Hornbeck is the company that brought the suit that resulted in the first moratorium being overturned in a federal court in New Orleans. I was just looking at their website this morning, and they're reviewing the new moratorium, so we'll see what happens with them. I'm not going to talk about every word on every slide because we've got a lot to cover here today, but I think you can see that some businesses have very direct negative effects, and some have less negative effects, but there are an awful lot of people down on the Gulf Coast that depend in one way or another on either fishing or oil and gas production, and pretty much all of them have been affected. State and local governments, too. If you think about the the amount of money that the state government is spending on the supplies and materials, employee overtime, police, fire, emergency services workers, and then all these people have to be housed and fed, and their equipment has to be maintained and fueled. So there's an awful lot of money being spent there, and I'm going to talk a little bit about budgets, governmental budgets here in a minute. I'm not sure if they can afford to continue at this rate. And the indirect losses that governments have, if the government has reduced tax revenues, that's certainly a loss to them. I don't know that that's recoverable. I'll leave that to the participants in this room, or not in this room, but on this call. And then, some of the difficult to measure impacts are if fisheries have been materially harmed. We don't know how long it'll take for first the oysters and shrimp and fish to return in the same quantities they were there before, and then secondly, how long it'll take for the harvested fish to be sufficiently safe to eat, and when there will be approval for commercial fishing to resume. This chart here shows a little bit of the geographic boundaries of the prohibition on commercial fishing, and I believe this was as of the 7th of June. So even though this slide's about a month out of date, I have 2 more slides later on where you can see that as the oil moves, the ban on commercial fishing area increases too, and once it gets around the tip of Florida, it'll be really a pretty large area. Then we have some impacts that we just can't measure at all at this time. Unless the well has been sufficiently capped today, which is a possibility, we don't know how long this is going to go on, and we don't know how long it'll take for, like I said, for the fisheries to return. And then moreover, how long will it take to restore those coastal areas to a state where tourists will want to go back and the people can resume the lives that they used to have. So in a few minutes we're going to talk about past losses and future losses. And these questions go to the issue of future losses. How long will the impact exist? How long will it take before we can say that damages are cut off for someone or some company that has been impacted by this? And, in any measure of economic damages, claimants are obligated to reduce their losses wherever possible, and all of these people have a mitigation obligation. And I think that because it's impossible to state how long this event's going to last, it's difficult for people to make informed decisions about whether they should close down now, whether they should reposition the business, whether they should pack up and move away. They have an obligation to reduce their losses, but I'm not sure they have enough information to reduce their losses well, at least now. And here's some liability unknowns, at least to me. I'm not sure how all of the various liability fits. I've been reading what Kenneth Feinberg's been saying to the Small Business Committee and Congress a couple of weeks ago, and what he's been saying to reporters. And he seems to believe that the $20 billion trust fund is for the liability of BP exclusively. Transocean was the owner and the operator of the rig. There were some other contractors on the rig as well. And then Anadarko Petroleum owned a 25% working interest in this well. So normally, a working interest owner would have a similar percentage of liability, but Anadarko has taken the position that because this was gross negligence on BP's part, they're not going to contribute to the fund. I'm just now seeing some messages that some people were having trouble hearing me. I apologize. And then last, I'm sure, it's a loss too to people who have a loss in quality of life if they can no longer enjoy the birds or wildlife or the enjoyment of the beach. Now, I'm not sure what their position for recovery would be. And then here's some mitigating considerations. We know that people who are operating boats, commercial fishermen and others, had an opportunity to pick up some short-term work from BP by deploying booms, by ferrying crews and supplies out to the area of the well, and so on. I don't have any idea how much they were paid relative to what their revenues would have been had they been fishing or taking sport fishers out. The provisioning of the boats is something that these people had an opportunity to do, but this cuts into the commercial companies that did that routinely, companies like Hornbeck that had contracts to do such things. So I think that figuring out, measuring both the mitigation opportunity and measuring the amount of reduced loss because of actions claimants took, will take a fair amount of work. Then government entities, I think here are the questions that someone would need to figure out in putting together a claim for a governmental entity. And that is, how much effort should they really put into the cleanup? If they have a finite budget, do they stop cleaning up when their budget's exhausted, or are they obligated to try to find resources elsewhere? And when you think about the erosion of their tax base, what could a parish or a city do to keep their people there, to keep property values from going down? I'm not professing to know the answers to those, but those are certainly questions that would come up in a court and perhaps in arbitration. And Mr. Feinberg might even ask those questions himself. And I've pretty much covered the mitigation issues facing individuals already, but I believe that a lot of people are in a pretty difficult spot in terms of deciding whether they should move or stay, whether they should stay in the business they were in or find a new business, and then, whether if they have something saleable, for instance, if they had one of these motor hotels, should they try to sell that property while occupancy is either down or they have cleanup workers staying there, or should they tough it out and hope it returns? I don't, I guess each situation will be handled individually. Those are things to think about. And then why would you want to close down? Well, I think the best reason is someone who decides to throw in the towel and leave today is going to limit their total loss. And also, it makes the total loss known. So from the standpoint of recovery, they might be in better shape to have a boundary drawn around their total loss now, something they could take forth in a claim, as opposed to someone who might operate the business for a few more years and then figure out that that they've lost a lot more money than the business was worth. So there are advantages both ways. And the culture along the coast is one where a lot of people are kin to other people living locally, and they need to sever their ties from family members, sever their ties from real estate they own, and really change the way they live if they're going to leave. The hospitality industry and restaurant operators have the same decisions, same decisions to make, though I think it'll be more clear-cut for them because day to day they can see what their occupancy is and how well the restaurant's doing, and also a lot of those businesses aren't too well capitalized, so they won't necessarily have the option to continue to operate long-term and wait and see what happens. I apologize. I was talking to slides and not reading the messages. if anyone still has trouble hearing me, please send me another note, and I'll see what I can do to improve this. So I think it was around 1990, the Oil Pollution Act was passed, and it provided for both payment into a trust fund and recovery for certain things from that trust fund. Now, I read that Kenneth Feinberg has said that OPA, or the Oil Pollution Act Fund, is only about $1 billion. This slide shows what's recoverable from the Oil Pollution Act Fund if anyone wants to file a claim there. And I'm going to tell you something that's not on the slides from an interview that Kenneth Feinberg gave yesterday to Fortune magazine. He's drawn a bright line between recovering from the $20 billion trust fund that he's administering and recovering from OPA. And one of the things he said is you sort of have to pick, go one place or another, or you can file with him, and if you're not able to reach an agreement over several years, then you can try at OPA, but you might be back in the queue for another several years there. He also points out something that I didn't know when I wrote this presentation, and that is that he's going to rely very heavily on documentation and very heavily on whether or not someone was directly impacted in determining whether or not they'll get a settlement. And the third thing he said was it's going to be an all or nothing settlement. He's not interested in paying people for their current losses, that he's going to offer $1 amount that settles past and future claims, and the claimants will have to either accept that or go elsewhere. There won't be any halfway measures. He also said before the Small Business Committee that if someone brings a claim because their business is 3 blocks from the beach and there's no more tourists, but the beach wasn't directly impacted, it's just a matter of a perception of tourists that he didn't believe that such things would be a legitimate claim. So, we'll see how he ends up paying this out. For those of you who don't know, Kenneth Feinberg administered the Agent Orange Fund for soldiers in Vietnam that were impacted by this defoliant chemical that was dispersed there. And then he, is more well known for administering the 9/11 Victims Fund that for Congress appropriated about $6 billion. And I was able to download from the Department of Justice his final report on the 9/11 victims. And it's several hundred pages. I haven't read it all, but it looks like he made it a lot easier for payments to be made if the person had either died or was physically injured. For persons and businesses that had no physical injury, for instance, if someone had a business in or around the World Trade Center that was destroyed, I can't tell that he paid anything at all. He may have, but he really emphasizes sort of the personal aspect of it, personal injury or death there. Of course, there were only 11 deaths in the BP disaster, so that shouldn't be as much of a consideration. So I'm going to stop here in a minute and give you a chance to ask a few questions. But in measuring the loss, either the value of the business or the economic damages, the lost income, profits, there's some general considerations that kind of cut across most situations. The first, of course, is the amount of claims should be the lesser of two numbers. Either the value of the business just before it was destroyed or just before it was impacted, or the amount of income that was foregone, the lost profits during the damage period. Here we don't really know what the damage period is yet, so we don't yet have enough information to say with certainty which businesses were destroyed versus which ones have only been degraded.
The valuation dates, are really important for putting together these calculations, and I believe almost all of them should be the date of the blowout, which is April 20. I believe the blowout happened around 11 o'clock at night on the 20th. And I just talked about it's either going to be business value or lost profits, but you also could look at the standpoint of diminished business value. If someone had a hotel that was worth $2 million, 30% of their occupancy goes away, they become very nearly break even, then the business value is roughly the cost of the building structure and other assets there and net of liabilities, not a value based on the income.
So, in that case, you might calculate the difference between what the business was worth pre-April 20 and what the business is worth now, and that gives you a comprehensive dollar amount for the claim. And the reason I'm making this distinction is you can do business valuation today, whereas it's not possible to calculate lost profits without knowing what the damage period is. And for a lot of these businesses, we don't know how long they'll be impacted, so a lost profits calculation would be quite difficult. Also, for the most part, in a lost profits claim, income taxes are usually ignored. And the reason is, if someone had income, they would pay income tax on those earnings. And if there's a recovery from another party, that's taxed in the same way. If the business is destroyed, there's provision in the tax code that the person can take the settlement and put it into a similar business and defer the taxes indefinitely. I think here there might be some unique situations where businesses are destroyed and the people who are running them might not have the skill, ability, or help to reinvest it. So they may suffer an adverse tax impact as a result of this, and therefore maybe taxes should be considered. Let's see. For individuals, of course, you're looking at their lost earnings or lost earnings capacity, and the period for the individuals when they'll be reemployed in the same line of work or when they'll be employed elsewhere. Of course, up to their actuarial working life. Now, here's a general model for lost profits. It's just lost revenue minus cost avoided. Imagine a commercial fisherman. They're not harvesting anything, they're not selling it, but they're also not burning up a lot of fuel, and they save on labor costs. So the difference between those two numbers is their lost income, and then there will be interest on past losses for the most part, and then a discount on future losses. That is, the losses that happened in the past is customary to give them either prejudgment interest or market interest up to the date of the award, and for things in the future, you need to back that interest out or discount it. We're about 26 minutes into the presentation. We're at 38 slides. I'm not going to talk about every one in detail, so this is a chance for you to ask questions, and if you can't hear me, let me know.
Okay, Lynn, thank you very much. I do have a couple of questions here. The first one I have is from Paul, and his question is, any idea on how businesses and or states are planning on treating unemployment compensation while individual claims are pending with BP or within the OPA fund?
I'm not going to be able to answer that one. I do not know. I was at this conference last week. The junior senator from Louisiana was there. Some people from the parish government were there. They talked about a lot of things, but not at all about the funding of unemployment compensation. I just don't have any idea.
Okay, that's fair. The second question is, when dealing with an unknown time factor, how do you begin to factor that into the formula of loss? You spoke of, the unknown time of how long the impact or how great the impact will be over a period of time. How does one go about factoring in that into the loss?
Well, the best way, because you need to put together a calculation that is comprehensive when you present it to the trier of fact. So, in my view, the best way to do it is to move away from lost profits and move to business value. For instance, if a company was making $100,000 a year net after tax, and their income's reduced to $50,000 a year, and this is a very simple example. A lost profits calculation would be, well, what's $50,000 a year times all the years they'll be impacted, and we'll figure out the build up back to their old revenue level and discount all that back. If you don't know the time frame, that's where you are here. There's another way to look at it, and that is what's the diminished value of the business. And that's as of a point in time, as of April 20. So you could say, well, on April 20, and look at some other similar businesses for, similar profits and so on. Let's say on April 20, this business was worth, $5 million. We know their income is reduced by half, and, approximately, where you could say, well, it used to be worth $5 million, now it's worth hard assets plus half of what that income was valued at before. And you might come up with a number of, something a little bit north of $2.5 million. So how much is the diminished business value? The difference between the $5 million it was on April the 19th and approximately $2.5 that it is now. And then you don't have to worry about how long the time frame is, because you know that the business value went down that day. So that's a way to collapse all of these otherwise lost profits calculations into one point in time and present that.
Okay, I have another question from Virginia, and her question is, how do we calculate damages for lost profits from real estate that was already listed for sale at the time of the blowout?
Well, that's going to be tricky. I think that, let me first say what Ken Feinberg said. He said there's not enough money in the world to pay all the real estate claims. So that might be one that you end up litigating. But if you wanted to look at how much of the diminished value was associated with a blowout, I think it would be pretty simple to first compare the subject property to other properties on April 19 or periods prior to April 19. And that gives you kind of an index to what's it worth in a poor real estate environment. And then between now and the date you bring your claim, you'll have other data, what other similar properties have actually sold for. So you'll have a measure of how much farther down the prices went of similar properties since April 19. And even if they paid $1 million for the property and it's worth $800,000 on April 19, you're going to come up with some lower number now. And I don't see any problem attributing that difference between the April 19 value and the current value to the blowout, since nothing else has really happened to real estate in that period.
Okay, thank you, Lynn. And here's our final question for this break. And the question is, when does the general model, which I guess was from the previous slide, apply? Is this the sort of thing that Kenneth Feinberg is looking for?
Well, I believe it's the sort of thing Kenneth Feinberg's looking for. He is going to publish a protocol by the end of this week, and he's going to publish forms, supposedly with a protocol very shortly thereafter. So the answer to the last question is, yes, this seems to be what he's looking for. However, more than that, he really wants to see all the underlying evidence that supports that calculation. I have some slides in the back that are checklist on how you make sure that you have the documentation to support it. Have I answered all of that, Carol, or did I miss something?
Yes, thank you. Well, that's all the questions for now, so we can return to the presentation.
Okay, great. Thanks for
Okay,
hanging on.
and by the way, right now I can hear you fine. I know we had some issues with you fading in and out, but right now I can hear you fine.
Great. I had some issues when I logged on. I couldn't hear anything for a while, so I think we've got it straightened out.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Okay. Now let's first go from from the general model to specifics, because whether you're in a court or an arbitration before Kenneth Feinberg, it's necessary to prove lost profits or prove diminished business value, not just put forth the calculation. So in the general model, the right place to start is the top line, to estimate lost revenue. And, there are several sort of generally accepted methods to do this. And you'll see some of these methods applied in other areas like real estate appraisal or the appraisal of equipment or other things. So the before and after method is what I was alluding to a minute ago. You can look at what the revenue production was prior to April 20, what the revenue production is later, you figure out what the difference is, extrapolate that to the total damage period, lost revenue. I'm going to talk to you about cost in a minute. That's sort of like the past and future method too. The past and future method, sorry about that, the past and future method really looks at trends, so it's a little more sophisticated than before and after. You might say, well, we were a growing business in the past, still a growing business, but with a few more calculations, you can figure out what the difference is. Statistical methods are pretty much looking at the past and using statistics to forecast the future. This is one of my least favorite approaches because I think that one is hard to explain, it's hard for the trier of fact to understand, it's hard for the jury to understand, and it's really not that reliable. It's not any more reliable than the other methods in my experience. Though I guess for very, very large populations, it probably is a better method. The benchmark method is useful when a lot of different factors are affecting a business, and you have diminished revenue, and you need to attribute a portion of that loss to the oil spill, and there might be other things that are affecting it too. So you could benchmark this business relative to other businesses that are not impacted by all of the same factors. And in that way, you can sort out the portion that is associated with a spill versus other things. You can also, in some cases, use a statistical method to do this. And the last, a contract method applies for companies that are operating under known contracts that have been impacted. If someone had a contract to supply fuel and fresh water to the rig 7 days a week, and now they're doing it 0 days a week, you know exactly what their lost revenue is based upon their contract. After the loss of revenue has been calculated, then the next calculation is figuring out what cost would have been associated with those revenues had the revenues been earned. That's their cost avoided. You know, they didn't bring in the revenue, but the cost of producing it also isn't there. So this is a savings to the business. I like using the cost structure method, looking at the business model that is being used. And you can figure out which costs are fixed as to time, like rent and insurance and utilities maybe, and which costs are variable. You know, the cost of fueling the boats or paying the labor that you laid off. So you can calculate it in that way. You can also do it, you know, by laying out all the kinds of costs that the business incurs and looking at each line on a judgment basis. This is helpful for a business that doesn't have detailed accounting records, where you could talk to the business owner, the people operating on that site, and ask them specifically the nature of those costs and determine which ones varied with revenue and which ones did not. Now, the result of either method is going to be that second line is what's the cost avoided in this lost profits claim. Now, you might need to figure out what the mitigation is, either the mitigation realized or the mitigation that could have been realized that wasn't. So in the general approach to calculating lost profits, I have assumed, that's usually how you see it presented, that the mitigating efforts are already built in. You know, if someone lost half their revenues and recaptured a portion of it, then the lost revenue is net of mitigation. You might see some pushback from defendants here that someone could have mitigated losses but did not. And in that case, I think it's necessary to determine the amount of mitigation that was available and put that as an additional line in the general approach to the calculation. You know, figuring out what could have been exploited if it wasn't, of course, is a lot more complicated than figuring out what was actually recovered in mitigating efforts. Now, I don't want to spend a lot of time on this, but this is important to some litigators. Past losses, a claimant is entitled to interest on it. And they might get interest at market rates or the rate at which they were able to show a return on their deployed capital in the past, or at some statutory rate. And that would usually be from past losses from the first date of impact all the way to the date of trial, arbitration, or the date of the damage award. And then for future losses, you know, the reverse is true. Those things need to be discounted back at a discount rate, and the bigger the discount rate, the lower the claim is going to be. And that discount rate's got three components. It's the current risk-free rate of interest plus expected inflation plus a premium for risk. Now, the first two of those you can see by looking at Treasury bills, which is considered the safest investment. Treasury bills have an inflation factor in them. So right now you can get 10-year Treasury bills and only earn about 3%. The discount rate is going to be 3% plus some risk factor. It depends. The risk factor depends on the nature of the business and the size of the business, but you know, it's generally going to be in the 15 to 20 up to 25% range. That's for lost profits. Don't look at tax law for that, because in tax law, discount rates end up being higher because they go to marketability, not to a business that was impacted without a choice being made. So let me talk just a little bit about this one technical issue. So there are two different approaches to figuring out what the loss is. Now, I'm just going to go to the following slide so you can see it. It depends on what court you're in. And the title is not quite correct. It should be ex ante versus ex post. So in the ex ante method of applying discount, you see that you have the damage period start date, and then the first section of that second line there is the damage period up to the trial date. Then the next section is damages from the trial date to some end date. So in the ex ante method, all of those losses are discounted back to the date of impact, in this case, back to April the 20th. And then from the date of impact to the trial date, prejudgment interest is awarded, usually statutory interest. So, you know, it might be in the relevant state law and the state where this occurs that this is the way to do it. But also, this particular method is sometimes helpful to plaintiffs because often the statutory interest is greater than the market interest. It can be good for defendants, too, if the discount rate is pretty high. So, you know, usually you get different people pushing for different methods depending on where the numbers come out for their case. The ex post method is the one that I believe makes the most economic sense. And that's where you apply interest to all past losses. And the interest applied, economically speaking, should be the amount of return this business was able to get on its deployed capital. How much interest they could have made on that money if they would have had it. The discount is from the end of the damage period only back to the trial date. So then you have economic interest applied in both directions. What they could have earned in the past and the discount rate that reflects what they could have earned or what their earning history was, plus risk, the risk that maybe something bad will happen in the future, in order to get everything present valued as of the date of trial. I will leave that to you, whether this is important or not. I wanted to point it out because even though it's just a technical difference, it can change the numbers very substantially. Okay, so business value or lost profits, I've sort of talked to this already, that lost profits are easier to calculate when you know a lot of information about the business model in use, the type of costs and type of customers the business has, and how long the damage period is. If the business has been destroyed or damaged in some way, you can look at the business value difference and get a number as of one point in time. Let's see. What are some of the valuation unknowns? There are two that are sort of a mystery to me, and that is, well, in the case of an individual, it's pretty easy to figure out what their lost income is. They got hurt on the job or something like that happened to them. Those calculations go on all over the country every working day of the year. In the case of a lost line of work, like someone who was an oysterman, I'm not sure how you really put a value on that. I think it's more like the loss of an entire business where you need to figure a long damage period, including retraining and relocation. But I'm not certain. I just don't quite know what the right approach is in that case. A lot of times lost earnings for individuals assume reemployability. I have some doubt that some of the older commercial fishermen along the Gulf Coast will be able to retrain, relocate, and go into another similar business before the end of their expected working life. I talked about taxes already. Usually we don't deal with taxes. In this case we might, because we're not certain whether the person can avoid tax on their recovery or not. Now, I have the second question up, and the second question period here, and I see a question's already been presented, unless you wanted to read that, Carol, so that other people can hear it.
Sure. As Virginia asked, would it be better to sell real property now and take the loss so it can be more specifically quantified in the owner's claim, or should the owner present the claim based on projected losses?
Well, of course, the owner needs to figure out what their long-term plans are and not make the decision solely for developing a strong claim. But I really believe that the claim is more likely to be paid if the total loss is known. There's just sort of a bias in our court system. And if you can document the loss from the sale, you're in a much stronger argument. You have a much stronger argument to Mr. Feinberg than if you just bring in some statistics and say, well, it was worth more in the past, it's worth less now. And also, if you don't sell now, there's always the possibility that it will go back up. And, a lot of triers of fact will latch onto that. Maybe your stock went down in value today, but, you haven't sold it. It might go up, you might end up with a profit in the future. So I believe that you're better off if you want to press the claim to take your loss and try to settle up.
Okay, and then I only have one other question for this particular break. And that question is, in all of these calculations, what is the most troublesome or risky aspect of the calculation? And what would you do if a claimant's business records conflicted with what the claimant believes the losses are?
Well, the trickiest aspect really is the development of the discount rate. Because let's imagine $100,000 that's going to be earned 5 years into the future. That discount rate includes risk. So if you come up with a discount rate of 25%, You're taking 25% out of that $100,000 every year for 5 years. It makes it a pretty low number. On the other hand, if if you're able to justify that the business was stable, of low risk, and the people who are managing it, were experienced with it, then you could come up with a much lower discount rate. Well, the discount rate, in the way that it works with future losses, really affects the damage number quite dramatically. So, and that's the one you really want to be able to defend. So you want to be able to say this discount rate is reasonable based on a lot of good information. And that good information is to be comparable businesses. You can buy such data. Now, I do not have it. I usually buy it based on the business that's being valued. It's not inexpensive. Sometimes you'll pay $1,000, $1,500 just to get information on comparables to do your discount rates, but you can also buy sort of books that show the general guidelines. Now, what if the guy running the business says, and I've heard this a lot in my career, says, well, I lost $1 million a year. And then you start looking at the underlying business records and you figure out this business never made $1 million a year. So how could they be losing $1 million a year based on this event? Well, that's just one where there's a conflict between the perception of the people managing it and what the underlying records show. And I think you'll probably find with these smaller businesses that, maybe some of them were cheating on their taxes, not declaring everything. But I believe the only way to deal with that gap is to rely on the most reliable information. Look at the business records as they existed. Well, you might correct them for some other known and verifiable things. But I certainly don't believe you can just go in and offer up the opinion of the manager on site, because that's just not, it's not verifiable. And Kent Feinberg has more or less said that. There's going to be records, records, records. Also, while Feinberg's not published his claim forms yet, BP had claim forms on their website for a couple of months. They've taken them down now. Well, actually, I have a slide on this. I'll talk about it in a minute. Was that the last question, Carol?
Yes, that's it. We do have 2 more questions, but I'm going to hold those until the end of the presentation.
All right, and I see we've got 10 minutes left, and it's only about 10 slides. I'm going to go through them quickly because these next 4 slides really are I didn't prepare them so I could talk about every paragraph, but to offer up both a relationship between the party that's impacted, whether their losses are direct or indirect, how long it's likely to be, and then more importantly is the approach to calculating the loss. So for the federal government, they have the immediate losses and some unknown future losses, and then how do you calculate their losses? Well, it's going to be pretty simple because the federal government's got lots of accounting records. You know how much it costs to deploy the National Guard. You know how much the Coast Guard's spending. It's just a matter of adding it up. So what I've done is that for each of these slides, I've drawn up where to go and how to approach the calculation of loss for that entity. In the private sector, you've got different sorts of business entities. All the ones listed here were directly impacted, and some are going to have longer losses than others. This is a takeaway for you, not for me to deal with every single paragraph. Let's see, private sector, page 3 are the businesses that are indirectly hotels and restaurants, the businesses that serve those people on the front lines. What are some potential issues over the longer term? We don't know about the damage to the coast, the water, and if this stuff comes inland into the wetlands, there will be additional businesses affected that have not yet been. And here's the checklist of peripheral considerations. And if nothing else, I recommend you print this slide and keep it. No matter what side you're on, I think these are questions you need to be able to answer before you put together a defensible claim or before you defend against a claim. You know, things as simple as, did this business have the necessary permits and licenses? You know, at least in California, even if a business was destroyed, if they weren't licensed, they can't recover any lost profits. You need to get a rational basis for the decisions they made. On the defense side, it's more a matter of verifying that the documentation is consistent with the claim, that the claim's reasonable in light of similarly placed businesses, and make sure you settle up with the right entity, because especially with smaller businesses, they may have 2 or 3 different entities going on and only sue in one name, and then next week figure out that they should have been suing based on this entity controlled by the 401k as well. Now, the burdens and reasons slide goes to what things were asked for on BP's claim forms. And some of this stuff, I think a lot of smaller businesses would have trouble producing. They should be able to produce their income tax returns. That's not a problem. But BP's claim form stated that you needed to attach all this stuff. Things like monthly income statements by department with details of all revenues and expenses by category from January 2000 to present. I got to tell you, there are a lot of small businesses that never produce that stuff and sure wouldn't be able to do it for the claim. As well as a description of accounting policies and a statement as to the basis of the account preparation. Publicly traded companies do such things. Smaller businesses often do not do this formally. So, I think that a lot of documentation is being asked for by BP. Mr. Feinberg's likely to ask for a lot of it too. And, I rely on your skills as lawyers to convince him what he should be entitled to and what he doesn't really need. My comments are sort of what the counter arguments are. For instance, you should consider the level of accounting sophistication of the claimant. A person who harvests oysters is not likely to be trained in accounting. Yet, they can still operate their business well and support themselves, for an entire lifetime without ever understanding the accounting to any great degree. And that's the same way with a lot of internal reports. Is the simpler the business, the less need there is for formal reporting. The sole proprietor who understands everything doesn't really need a lot of financial reports because that person knows what's going on day to day. I see someone's asked, is it possible to print a copy of the slides? I'm going to let Carol answer that in just a minute, and I'm going to finish on time because I know all you guys need to get back to work. So here's the history of the claims and claims processing. BP put together this website, and BP has been paying only emergency payments. I heard Daryl Willis speak last week. He's the young man you see on the BP commercials. He's a guy who's a native of Southeast Louisiana. He's a geologist. He's been with BP for 20 years. He's driving around his Buick. That's his tagline. Driving around his Buick, visiting everyone on the Gulf Coast. You stay there as long as it takes. So Daryl doesn't know anything about law, liability, accounting, or finance. And he says that. He's a geologist who's there to help the people in Louisiana. And I don't doubt his sincerity. He seems like a really nice, sincere guy. BP's hired more than 900 insurance adjusters only to process claims for emergency payments. And what their goal is to make sure no one misses a house note or a car note or goes hungry. That's what their goal is. Only Kent Feinberg is going to settle up based on some diminished business value, lost value, or lost profits. He's going to take control of the claims process in approximately late August. I don't know what his attitude is going to be about attorney's fees. So I'd say keep watching for Mr. Feinberg to take over. But late August is the schedule according to this BP guy, Darrell Willis. And, you know, you probably know this, disastersystems.gov, you know, is a good place to go for BP, but then there are some other very similar names that are the names of some of your competitive law firms out there who are looking for clients. Cautions and conclusions, you know, my main caution is point 2. Think about the possible future events before you agree to a settlement, no matter which side you're on, because you know, for a claimant, you know, the future could get a lot worse, and for the defendant, you know, maybe all this oil is just going to wash on out into the ocean, and maybe damages won't be that bad or that long. So that's going to be a tough judgment call on everybody's part. Let's see, that's really all I have here. Credits for these great photos, mostly from Louisiana Emergency Management. And everything in this presentation can be found on these websites, save for the ex post ex ante slide, which is referenced on that slide. All right, now I'll take the final questions, and we're done.
Okay, thank you so much, Lynn. I have a question from Bruce, and he states, Feinberg seems to be changing his original position, which was a lot more liberal as to what legit claimants would be. It appears he is now going to be treating the claim as insurance business interruption claim, that direct physical damage is necessary to the claimant property to collect. Can you comment on that?
Well, my comment is I couldn't agree with you more. On June 30, he was testifying before Congress. You know, he took some positions there. Shortly thereafter, he said, you know, there's really just not enough money to pay the real estate claims, and he doesn't think certain diminished real estate claims would be compensable. Here's the quote. This is from the June 30 testimony. If there's no physical damage to beaches, and it's a public perception, I venture to say that it is not compensable. So on June 30, he was testifying before the Small Business Committee, and he was trying to say he would do what he could, and he shortly after that says there wasn't enough money. I heard an interview on the radio with him about a week ago where he was talking about got to be documentation. Actually, you can find this, npr.org, look at, you can get a download of the Diane Reams show where she interviewed Mr. Feinberg. She asked the question, what about businesses who weren't paying taxes? So they won't have tax records to show you. You know, are those people just out of luck? And he more or less said yes. You know, he said he wasn't going to pay any claims unless there was documentation. People were obligated to pay taxes. He said he would consider alternative documentation if someone could bring in sales receipts, show some record of what their actual cash receipts were, what their cash costs were, and show that they were associated with business. So he seems to be tightening up. The July 12 Fortune article is one where he seems to be, you know, sort of becoming more strict about what the documentation will be. But the real telling thing is going to be when he publishes the claim protocol later this week. Now that hopefully will answer this question definitively.
Okay, thank you, Lynn. I have another question. This question comes from Raquel. And the question reads, has there ever been a study on the effects of the dispersants of this quantity on the sea life?
Well, that's beyond my expertise, but I've been looking at some of the LinkedIn groups, and if you're familiar with LinkedIn, it's a business networking site, and there's a LinkedIn group on Gulf oil spill, and there have been some discussions of that on that site. So remember, this just came off the internet, so I'm not sure how reliable it is, but the general discussion was that no one was aware of a good study, though the EPA raised concerns about the dispersant early on. I think the EPA tried to stop the dispersant from being used. But I think there are two general effects to research. One is whether the dispersants in themselves are toxic to sea life or humans. And then second, the effect of the dispersants, because that makes the oil mix with water and travel farther, is a consequential effect of the dispersants that the oil effects are more widespread. I can't answer those, but I think they're two good questions to follow up on.
Thank you, Lynn. And just for information's sake, this is the first part of a three-part series regarding the Gulf oil spill, and one of our webinars, actually, which is scheduled on the 27th of July, will address the chemical dispersants, and all of you will receive invitations to that webinar as well. So I just wanted to bring that to the attention of everyone, should there be any interest in that topic. I have another question here from Bruce, and he asks, what is the damage end date? Do we have one?
I don't think we have a damage end date. Well, let me back up. It depends on the business. If the moratorium on drilling is lifted at the end of November, what's being put forth by Ken Salazar right now would only go to November. If that moratorium ends in November, then for the exploration and production businesses, you can say that the end of their damage period is November 30, or at least up to some date when the amount of activity in the Gulf approximates what it was April 20. So you would know it for them. There are a lot of other businesses, though. Suppose someone had, some publicly traded companies have casinos on the Gulf Coast. If the hotel and gaming and the restaurant revenues are diminished in that hotel, even if drilling restarts December 1, it may be a long time before those revenues go back up, and you wouldn't know the end date for that.
Okay, I have another question from Raquel, and she asks, how can we calculate future losses against costs avoided when, for example, a fisherman had been preparing, investing for his commercial fishing business at the time of the explosion?
Well, the lost profits have to be calculated based on what business he was in, not the prospective business he planned to be in. Proving lost profits for a startup business or for a business that never made profit is exceedingly difficult. It can be done, but you're looking only at projections, based upon, some marketing information and some accounting and financial information, and that's it. And it's very much subject to the challenge of being speculative, and it's very hard to do. So for the prospective business, my recommendation would be to look at it from the standpoint of a lost investment. And for the operating business, look at that from the standpoint of either business value or lost profits. And that way, the client can be made whole, even though there's an opportunity cost there. The money he might have made in the new venture that will never be recovered. It's better to get something than nothing.
Okay, I think we have one more question, and here is the final question. How much time do you require to put together business lost profits or business valuation?
It really depends on the complexity of the business and the quality of the underlying records. For any sort of businesses, let's say has 50 or 100 employees, it's going to take you 3 to 4 weeks at a minimum to put a value on the business, and probably longer than that to put together a lost profits calculation. If it's a mom and pop, 12-room motel, you can probably do it in 5 or 6 days. But then again, it depends on the quality of the underlying records. If they don't have good accounting and business records, you can get bogged down on some of these small businesses for a long time too, because you have to prove the calculation. You can't just do it based on what they represent to you. But my caution would be you know, be talking to someone well in advance of the day that you're going to have to, you know, to disclose your damages or disclose your experts, because there are a lot of questions to be answered, and, you know, they can't be looked up, a lot of them can't be looked up in a book. You know, there's some elapsed time as well as the hours that actually go into doing the work.
Okay, Lynn, do you have time for one more question from Virginia? And this will be the final question. She asks, I heard Feinberg emphasize in one interview that an attorney is not necessary. Would you agree he appears biased against allowing any compensation for attorney's fees?
Well, I wouldn't want to say that I think he's biased, because I don't know him, but I think that you can look at his final report on the 9/11 Victims Compensation Fund, and he breaks down where all the money went. And I didn't see that any of it went to attorneys. So, you know, it may have been included in what he recorded as paid to victims. But I also think it's worth, in answering this question, it's worth thinking about Mr. Feinberg himself. I don't know, you know, how he supports himself necessarily, but in the 9/11 Victims Compensation Report, he shows fees to his firm as zero. And he has said that he's serving without compensation on this fund. So, you know, he might be a person that feels that attorneys aren't necessary. I don't know.
Okay, thank you so much, Lynn. That was very informative, and I thank you for taking the time to answer all of the questions, and I thank our attendees. We all know that your time is very valuable. We do appreciate you taking the time to view the presentations that we hopefully are very informative for you. I would like to, again, let you all know that this is the first of a three-part series in the Gulf oil spill incident. The next presentation is scheduled for the 22nd of July, and that will speak to the safety and toxicology issues related to the Gulf Coast. And then there is a third webinar scheduled on July 27, and that will be addressing the chemical dispersants. That is the conclusion of our presentation, and again, I thank you all very much, and have a great day. Many of you have, let me go back and just state that many of you have asked when the archive presentation will be available. That will be available tomorrow, and we will send out a link for all of you to take advantage of the presentation. And again, thank you very much, Lynn. It was a pleasure. Have a good day.
Thanks very much to everyone. Bye.